The air in Europe was heavy with the scent of smoke and exhaustion. Cities stood in ruins, bridges broken, train stations crowded with faces that carried both hope and despair. Yet among the rubble, a voice of authority echoed, "The war is over. You're free." Commanders spoke these words with finality, their uniforms still stiff with discipline, their eyes reflecting years of battle and sacrifice. To those who heard them, the phrase meant different things. For the civilians it was relief, a promise of survival. For soldiers it was a bitter taste of defeat or victory, depending on the flag stitched to their sleeves. For prisoners of war like Hans Keller, the sentence was not freedom at all. It was transition into the unknown. Hans stood among hundreds of men lined up in the ruins of a captured barracks. His uniform, once sharp and proud, hung loose on his thin frame. His hands trembled, not from fear of death anymore, but from uncertainty. At 26, he had survived countless battles, not by heroism but by instinct and a growing detachment from the ideology that had once consumed his nation. He thought the words "you're free" sounded strange in his ears, almost mocking. Free to go where? Free to return to a homeland reduced to ashes, or free only within the barbed wires of another camp in a land he had never seen? Around him, soldiers whispered, their voices carrying the bitterness of surrender. Some cursed their fate, others dreamed of seeing their families again, and a few, those still loyal to the Reich, vowed that this defeat was only temporary. Hans listened in silence, neither agreeing nor denying. Deep inside, he felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. All he had known, orders, discipline, war, was gone in a single announcement. The commander's words gave shape to an ending, but it was the whispers of his fellow officers that hinted at the beginning of something new. "They're taking us to America," one man muttered. "America feels like peace," another added in a hushed tone, almost fearful of believing it. Hans caught that phrase and let it linger in his thoughts. America. Peace. The two words clashed with everything he had been taught. Yet in the midst of ruin, the thought of crossing an ocean and stepping into a land untouched by bombs felt almost like a dream. He closed his eyes and remembered his sister, Anna, back in Munich. The last letter he had received before being captured spoke of hunger and fear, of nights spent in basements while bombs rained above. He wondered if she had survived the final months of chaos. The thought gnawed at him more than any chain could. Hans did not notice at first, but a faint smile touched his lips. Not of joy, but of something fragile, possibility. Perhaps the war had taken everything from him, yet left him with one last gift, the chance to start anew. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the smoke of the city mingled with the soft light of dawn. Somewhere beyond those ruins lay ships, and beyond the sea lay America. The name itself carried weight, spoken with suspicion by some, with reverence by others. For Hans it was an unanswered question, one that would soon shape his future. And so, as commanders dismissed the defeated, and the crowd of weary soldiers prepared for an uncertain journey, Hans Keller took his first step toward the unknown, carrying nothing but his fractured past and the faint promise of peace that waited across the ocean. But in the silence that followed the declaration of freedom, one truth remained clear. Endings were never simple, and beginnings rarely gentle. Stay with me as we uncover Hans's journey, where defeat transforms into discovery, and where the meaning of peace is tested in the most unexpected ways. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many stories like this waiting to be told, and your support ensures they are never forgotten. Hans did not yet know it, but his war was not truly over. It had only changed shape. The journey from Europe to the United States was a blur of days and nights blending into each other. Hans Keller, along with hundreds of other prisoners, was herded into a ship's hold, the air thick with sweat, rust and silence, broken only by the creak of metal and the distant rush of waves. No one spoke much during the voyage. They were too exhausted, too uncertain, their minds divided between fear of the unknown and relief that the killing fields of Europe were behind them. Hans often sat near the corner of the dimly lit hold, tracing invisible lines on the floor with his finger, as if mapping a future he could not yet see. He thought of Anna again, wondering if she would recognize him when he returned, or if he would ever return at all. The ship swayed endlessly, and each sunrise brought only the same grey horizon. America felt impossibly far, a land that existed more in rumour than in certainty. When the ship finally reached port, the prisoners were met with something Hans had not expected. Silence, not jeers. American soldiers stood guard, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, eyes watchful but not cruel. They gave short commands in English, words Hans barely understood, yet the tone carried no malice. The prisoners were marched into trucks, engines roaring as they left the harbour and rolled into the heart of a country Hans had never imagined. Hours later, the convoy stopped in the open plains of Texas. The first thing Hans noticed was the vastness of the land. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in shades of blue deeper than any he had seen in Europe. The air smelled of dust, grass, and something faintly sweet, like bread cooling on a distant table. For a man who had grown up in crowded streets and smoke-filled cities, the sight was disorienting. He whispered to himself, "So much space." The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, tall wooden towers, and neat rows of barracks, yet it lacked the menace Hans had expected. Instead of shouting or striking, the guards directed them firmly but without cruelty. Some even offered water before sending them to their quarters. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Was this real? Was it a trick? Hans could see the doubt in every furrowed brow, every cautious step. Inside the barracks, men sat on wooden bunks, murmuring to one another. The air was heavy with questions no one dared to answer. Hans's closest bunkmate, Otto, a farmer from Bavaria, leaned toward him and muttered, "They treat us better here than our own officers did." His voice was low, almost guilty, as if kindness itself were suspicious. Another man nearby, Ernst, snorted, "Don't be fooled. This is just another prison." Wires are wires, no matter how polite the guards are. Hans remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the faint light slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. He was torn. The camp was undeniably a prison, yet it did not feel like the ones he had imagined. No beatings, no snarling dogs. Only order, structure, and the ever-present hum of life outside the fences. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Hans lay awake listening to the distant sound of crickets. In Germany, night sounds had been sirens, explosions, or silence too deep to be safe. Here, the darkness was alive, not with fear, but with unfamiliar rhythms of nature. It unsettled him, yet it soothed him too. He thought of the phrase he had heard before leaving Europe. America feels like peace. It was still too soon to believe, but the land itself seemed to whisper something different from the iron discipline he had known. Still, shadows of doubt lingered. How long would this last? What did America truly want from them? Hans closed his eyes, the fence lines etched in his mind. Captivity had changed shape, but not yet meaning. And though Texas skies stretched endlessly above, freedom remained just out of reach. Morning light spilled into the camp, flooding the barracks with warmth that felt different from the grey dawns of Europe. Hans Keller rose slowly from his bunk, his body still adjusting to the rhythm of captivity in this new land. The air carried a faint scent of earth and grass, sharper than anything he had known back home. As he stepped outside, he stopped, struck by the sight before him. An endless sky, so blue it seemed unreal, stretching over fields that rippled like an ocean of green. He muttered to himself, almost in disbelief, "It doesn't smell of smoke here." Other prisoners shuffled out, their faces etched with suspicion. Otto, always blunt, let out a low whistle. "So much space! You could run forever and never see the end of it." Ernst, standing close by, shook his head. "Don't be fooled. This is a cage, no matter how wide the horizon looks." Hans said nothing, but his chest tightened at the thought. Ernst's words were true. Fences and watchtowers framed every view, but still, something about the openness gnawed at Hans. It was not the crushing confinement he had expected. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a possibility he could not name. Later that day, the prisoners were led out in groups to perform tasks within the camp perimeter. Hans walked with his hands tucked behind his back, his boots kicking at the dry soil. The sun beat down, stronger than the pale warmth he had known in Germany, and he felt sweat prickling at his collar. As they moved, the wind carried the distant aroma of bread, and somewhere, faintly, the notes of a fiddle. Hans stopped for a moment, breathing in the unfamiliar mix of scents and sounds. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. Otto squinted toward the horizon. "Music. Americans always find a reason to sing even in war." The group moved on, but Hans kept listening, straining for every note, as though each sound revealed a hidden truth about this land. Back inside the barracks, the mood was divided. Some prisoners speculated that the friendliness of guards and the openness of the land were nothing but tactics, meant to soften them. Wilhelm Braun, a tall officer with sharp features and eyes that never seemed to blink, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They feed us, they smile at us, and you fools believe this is kindness. It's strategy. They want to break us, to make us forget who we are. Don't be deceived." A silence followed his words, heavy and uncomfortable. Many nodded, fearful of challenging him. But Hans felt something shift inside. He did not answer, but doubt tangled with curiosity in his mind. Could kindness exist without manipulation? Could beauty be trusted when delivered by supposed enemies? That night, he lay on his bunk, the crickets outside filling the silence with their steady rhythm. His mind wandered back to the sky, the bread, the music. He thought of Anna, and wondered what she would say if she could see this place. Would she urge him to resist, or would she tell him to look closer at what was offered? He remembered Wilhelm's cold eyes, the certainty in his voice. Yet certainty now felt fragile. The propaganda of his youth had painted America as brutal, greedy, dangerous. But what Hans had seen so far did not match the picture. The contradiction unsettled him, but it also awakened something long buried. The need to question, to search for truth beyond orders and slogans. Hans turned on his side, staring at the dim beams of wood above his bunk. For the first time since his capture, sleep did not come quickly. The thought of America lingered in his chest, not as an enemy, not as a savior, but as a question waiting for an answer. Wilhelm Braun carried himself with the same rigid posture he had held on the front lines, as if defeat had not bent his spine. Even inside the camp, his boots struck the ground with sharp precision, each step reminding others of the rank he once bore. Among the prisoners, his presence loomed like a shadow. While others tried to adapt to their new surroundings, Wilhelm clung to the old ways, a living echo of the Reich. Hans noticed how quickly men gathered around him at night, leaning close to hear his words. Wilhelm never shouted. His voice was low and deliberate, weaving conviction into each sentence. That quiet certainty gave him power. "They treat us with smiles now," Wilhelm said one evening as the barracks settled into murmurs. "But never forget, they are our enemy. Their generosity is poison. If we accept it, we betray our homeland." Ernst nodded, his jaw tight. "You're right. They want us to forget discipline, to soften us. And when we return, we'll be nothing but shells of men." Otto shifted uncomfortably on his bunk. "But maybe it's not weakness to accept bread when you're hungry. Maybe it's just survival." Wilhelm's gaze snapped to him, cold and sharp. "Survival without honor is surrender. Is that what you want, Otto? To crawl back to your family as a beggar, thanking your enemy for pity?" Silence filled the barracks. Otto looked down, ashamed, though Hans saw his hands clenched tightly into fists. Hans remained still, caught between two forces. Wilhelm's words carried weight. He could feel the fear of betrayal spreading through the men. Yet deep inside, Hans could not dismiss the memory of the vast sky, the bread-scented wind, the unexpected music. He wanted to speak, to challenge Wilhelm's certainty, but his voice remained locked within. Later, as they lay in the darkness, Otto whispered across the room, "Hans, do you believe him?" Hans hesitated. "I believe he's afraid. Afraid of what it means if this place is not what we were told." Otto sighed. "Sometimes I think peace frightens him more than war." Hans turned those words over in his mind long after Otto drifted into sleep. It was true. Peace required surrender, not of weapons but of certainty, of the rigid structures that had defined their lives. For Wilhelm, letting go was a greater battle than holding a rifle. Days passed, and Wilhelm's influence grew stronger. He organized small groups of men during breaks, reminding them of discipline, urging them to march in step when no guards watched. To the others it felt like order. To Hans it felt like a chain. One afternoon, as they were led back from work detail, Wilhelm walked near Hans and spoke quietly, his tone heavy with warning. "You keep your eyes too long on the horizon, Keller. Remember who you are, remember where you come from. Don't let their tricks make you forget." Hans met his gaze, steady but silent. He felt the weight of those words pressing against him, demanding loyalty, demanding the old obedience. Yet inside, a quiet rebellion stirred. He was not sure what he believed anymore, but he knew it was not Wilhelm's truth. That night Hans dreamt of two roads, one lined with soldiers marching endlessly toward destruction, the other wide and open, filled with faces he did not recognize. When he woke, sweat dampening his shirt, he could still hear Wilhelm's voice echoing in his ears. Wilhelm Braun was more than a fellow prisoner. He was the embodiment of the past Hans wanted to leave behind, and the rival whose shadow he would have to step out of if he was ever to find peace. The Texas sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows across the dusty ground of the camp. The heat pressed against Hans's skin, sharp and unforgiving, yet the rhythm of the days began to shape itself into something almost predictable. Work, meals, restless nights. But beneath the monotony, something new stirred, a sense that life beyond the barbed wire was not only different, but somehow within reach. It was during a water break after a long morning of hauling timber that Hans first exchanged more than a passing glance with Michael O'Connor, one of the guards. Michael was tall, broad-shouldered, with freckles that seemed to multiply under the sun. His Irish heritage was evident in the lilt of his voice, and unlike most guards, he lingered near the prisoners with an ease that lacked menace. "You look like you're carrying more than wood on those shoulders," Michael remarked, his English slow as if to give Hans time to understand. Hans wiped the sweat from his brow, searching for the right words. "I carry memories. Heavy enough." His accent clipped the syllables, but Michael nodded, as though no translation was needed. From that day forward, their brief exchanges grew into conversations. Michael spoke of his family farm in Ohio, of the long winters where the earth froze solid and the summers where wheat swayed like golden oceans. Hans listened, absorbing every detail as if the words themselves painted landscapes in his mind. When Michael laughed, it was unguarded, a sound that reminded Hans of nights before the war, when laughter had not been rare. One evening, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, Michael walked beside Hans for a moment longer than usual. "Do you play music?" he asked suddenly. Hans blinked. "I once played the violin. Before the war." Michael grinned. "My father played the fiddle every Sunday." Nothing makes a man forget his troubles faster than a tune. That night, Hans lay awake replaying the conversation. He imagined a fiddle's sharp notes cutting through the stillness of the camp, mingling with the chorus of crickets. For the first time in years, he missed music, not as an escape but as something that connected people across walls and languages. But not everyone welcomed these exchanges. Inside the barracks, whispers spread quickly. Ernst muttered darkly, "Keller's getting too close to the Americans." Others nodded, some out of suspicion, some out of fear. Wilhelm, of course, was the loudest voice. "Do you think friendship will change what we are? Prisoners are prisoners." "Don't mistake their smiles for acceptance," Wilhelm declared, his eyes drilling into Hans across the dimly lit room. Hans clenched his jaw but said nothing. The accusations stung, but what stung more was the realization that they reflected the doubts he wrestled with himself. Was he betraying something by listening, by sharing, or was he simply choosing a different kind of survival? Days passed, and the bond with Michael grew quietly stronger. A joke shared during a long march, a story exchanged while watching the horizon, a nod of recognition that needed no words. Hans began to sense that trust could form even where fences stood tall. One afternoon, as Michael handed him a canteen of water, their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment Hans felt something he had not known since childhood: dignity. Not the forced pride of uniforms and parades, but the dignity of being seen as a man, not an enemy. The whispers of betrayal did not stop, but Hans no longer let them anchor him. Something in him was shifting, subtly, yet undeniably. And though the fences remained, he felt as though a small door had opened, one that might lead somewhere neither he nor Wilhelm could yet define. The camp mail arrived on a hot afternoon, carried in a small canvas bag by a guard whose face betrayed nothing of the treasure he held. For weeks Hans had watched other men receive letters, thin envelopes that brought laughter, tears, or silence so heavy it felt like grief. Each time his own name was not called, the ache inside him deepened. But that day, the guard's voice finally spoke it aloud. "Keller, Hans." Hans stepped forward, his pulse quickening as the envelope slid into his hand. The paper was thin, the handwriting instantly familiar. Anna. His sister's words had crossed an ocean to find him here, in this strange land. He carried the letter back to his bunk as though it were made of glass, afraid even the wind might snatch it away. When he unfolded the page, her voice came alive in his mind. "My dear brother, Munich is no longer the city you remember. The buildings stand like hollow teeth, broken and black. We wait in long lines for bread that never seems enough. At night I hear children crying from hunger, and I cannot silence them with promises anymore. But I am alive, and so is Mother. That is enough for now. I pray you are safe. I pray the war has not taken the light from your eyes." Hans read the lines again and again until they blurred. His chest tightened, not from sorrow alone but from the sudden clarity that struck him. Germany was not a cause, not a flag, not speeches shouted in the squares. It was Anna's trembling hand, their mother's frail body, the faces of people struggling simply to live. Otto noticed his expression and leaned closer. "News from home?" Hans nodded slowly. "She speaks of hunger, of ruins." "Of the despair." His voice cracked on the last word. Otto placed a rough hand on his shoulder. "At least she is alive. That is something." Wilhelm, who had been listening from across the room, spoke with a cold edge. "And what will you do with her words, Keller? Let them make you soft. The Reich will rise again, and families like yours will thrive only if we remain strong." Hans snapped his gaze toward him. "Strong? What strength is left in starving children? What strength is in ashes? My sister does not need a Reich. She needs bread." The barracks fell silent. Wilhelm's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. That night, Hans lay awake, the letter folded neatly beneath his pillow, as though closeness could keep Anna safer. He imagined her waiting in lines that stretched through the bombed-out streets, her hands clutching whatever crumbs she could gather. Each image sharpened his resolve. He no longer cared for speeches or slogans. Survival had a new meaning now, bringing life back to those who had none. The next day, during a break in their labor, Hans found himself speaking to Michael without hesitation. "Do you know what my sister writes? She says the city is broken, that children cry themselves to sleep from hunger." Michael's face softened. "I believe it. My own father told me about Ireland years ago when famine swept through. He said hunger changes a man more than bullets ever can." Hans felt a strange comfort in those words, as if pain was less isolating when shared. For the first time, he let his guard down fully. "I used to think loyalty meant obeying orders. Now I think it means finding a way to keep her alive." Michael studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds more like courage than any battlefield I've seen." As Hans returned to his barrack, the letter pressed against his chest, he understood that his path was shifting. He could no longer define himself by uniforms or by Wilhelm's rigid loyalty. His loyalty belonged to Anna, to life, to the fragile hope that somehow across fences and oceans he could still protect her. The prisoners were roused early, before the sun had fully risen. A whistle cut through the still air, followed by the shuffle of boots and the rustle of thin blankets being folded hastily. Hans stepped outside with the others, greeted by a horizon painted in shades of orange and pink. For a brief moment, He almost admired its beauty, but the voice of the guard snapped him back to reality. "Line up!" "Move!" They were marched out of the camp gates under watchful eyes, the air already warming with the promise of another sweltering day. A convoy of trucks waited, engines idling, their beds open for the men to climb aboard. Dust rose in clouds as the vehicles rolled away from the camp, carrying the prisoners deeper into the Texan landscape. The worksite was a sawmill, its sharp scent of cut pine filling the air. Logs lay stacked like sleeping giants, waiting to be stripped, cut, and hauled. The labor was heavy, relentless, and the sun climbed higher with every passing hour, burning the skin of men unaccustomed to such intensity. Hans gripped a saw with Otto, the rhythm of their work punctuated by grunts and the hiss of steel teeth cutting through wood. Sweat soaked his shirt, stung his eyes, but he pushed forward, finding an odd rhythm in the motion. Each cut, each push, became a battle not of survival against bullets, but of endurance against exhaustion. Otto groaned, wiping his forehead. "This sun is a worse enemy than any I faced in France." Hans gave a weary half-smile. "At least the sun doesn't shoot back." Nearby, Wilhelm barked orders at a few younger men, demanding precision even in captivity. "Stand straight, work faster. Show them we are not broken." His voice carried pride, but Hans noticed the trembling in his hands, the way his body betrayed fatigue, even as his mouth spoke of strength. During a short break, the prisoners sat in the shade of the sawmill wall, gulping down water from battered canteens. Hans leaned against the wood, his muscles aching, his throat raw from thirst. For the first time in years, he realized he was working not for war, not for ideology, but simply to earn the next hour of rest. Strangely, it felt more honest than anything he had done in uniform. Michael appeared then, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, his smile easy. "How's the work treating you, Keller?" he asked in English, his tone more friendly than commanding. Hans shook his head, catching his breath. "It makes a man feel small." He searched for the right words, his accent thick, but also alive. Michael chuckled. "Hard work will do that. My father used to say a day in the fields can cure a man of both arrogance and despair." Hans considered this, glancing at the men around him, faces slick with sweat, hands blistered, yet alive, undeniably alive. He thought of Anna's letter, of the hunger in Munich. Perhaps, he wondered, if she could see him now, she would not recognize him as a soldier, but she might see a man who still had strength to give. The break ended, and the men returned to labor. Hours stretched like days under the pitiless sun, but Hans kept moving, each swing of the saw becoming an act of defiance, not against guards or fences, but against the weakness that threatened to swallow him whole. When the trucks finally rumbled back toward camp at dusk, Hans sat with his back pressed to the wooden side, his body aching but his mind strangely clear. He realized that in work there was no ideology, no rivalry with Wilhelm, no whispers of betrayal. There was only effort, sweat, and the knowledge that he could endure. And in endurance, perhaps, lay a path to something greater. The trucks rattled along a dirt road, dust billowing in their wake, as the prisoners returned from another long day of labor. Hans sat wedged between Otto and Ernst, his body sore, his throat dry, his mind dulled by fatigue. Yet when the convoy slowed near a cluster of farmhouses, something unexpected stirred the monotony. Children ran alongside the road, barefoot, their laughter rising above the rumble of engines. They waved, not with mockery, but with simple curiosity. Some of the men looked away, unwilling to meet those bright eyes. Others, hardened by suspicion, muttered curses under their breath. Hans couldn't look away. The sight pierced through him, a reminder of Anna, of the childhood stolen from so many back home. At the next stop, the prisoners were ordered out to load supplies. The farm's yard smelled of hay and animals, a stark contrast to the resin-heavy air of the sawmill. As Hans bent to lift a crate, he felt a tap on his arm. He turned to see a woman, her hair tied back with a red cloth, her face flushed from the sun. She held out a small basket filled with cornbread and apples. "For you," she said in careful English, her eyes meeting his without fear. Hans froze, unsure if he understood correctly. The guards made no move to stop her. Michael, standing nearby, gave a faint nod, as if encouraging him to accept. Hans hesitated, then reached out. Danke, he whispered. The word felt fragile, almost dangerous. Otto's eyes widened as Hans broke the cornbread in half and handed it to him. Why would she give us this? Otto muttered, astonished. Hans didn't answer. He chewed slowly, the warm bread filling his mouth with flavors he hadn't tasted in years. Simple, earthy, real. He felt almost ashamed at how quickly gratitude overcame suspicion. Not everyone shared his reaction. Ernst scowled. It's a trick. She wants to see us beg. Don't you see? Wilhelm, who had been watching from a distance, stepped closer. His voice carried low but sharp. Do not mistake pity for respect. Take their food and you give them power over you. Hans's jaw tightened, but he kept eating, the bread dissolving like a memory of home. He spoke quietly, more to himself than to Wilhelm. Sometimes food is just food. Later, as the men loaded the final crates, a small boy approached, clutching a canteen almost too big for his hands. He held it up to Hans, who knelt instinctively to meet his gaze. The boy's eyes were wide, his face streaked with dust, but his expression held no fear. Water, the boy said softly. Hans accepted it, his throat tightening. He drank, then handed it back with a trembling smile. The boy grinned and ran off, his laughter echoing in the twilight. On the ride back, the prisoners were silent, each lost in thought. Otto broke the silence first. That bread tasted more honest than any speech I've heard in years. Hans nodded slowly. Yes, honest. Wilhelm scoffed. Fools. You let yourselves be touched by sentiment. You think they see you as men. To them, you are animals behind fences. But Hans was no longer listening. The image of the boy with the canteen lingered in his mind, stronger than Wilhelm's words. For a fleeting moment, he felt the walls of the camp blur, not gone, but softened by something simple and undeniable. Humanity. As night fell and the trucks rolled back into the compound, Hans carried that image with him. It was small, fragile, but it was enough to remind him that even in captivity, the world outside the wire still held kindness. And once a man has glimpsed kindness, it becomes harder to believe only in cruelty. Sunday arrived with an unusual announcement. The prisoners were told they could attend a local church service if they wished, under guard but without chains. The news spread through the barracks like wildfire. Some laughed bitterly, refusing to believe such a gesture could be genuine. Others whispered about escape, though everyone knew the surrounding plains offered nowhere to hide. Hans listened quietly, his curiosity stronger than his suspicion. When the time came, he joined the group escorted beyond the fences. The sun was bright, the air still carrying the faint scent of freshly cut hay. Hans walked with deliberate steps, each one heavier than it should have been. For months, his feet had known only confinement. Now they touched a road that led somewhere ordinary, somewhere unguarded. The church stood small and whitewashed, its bell tower modest but proud. Villagers had already gathered, their faces calm, their voices low as they greeted one another. The prisoners entered cautiously, their uniforms marking them as outsiders, yet no one spat, no one cursed. Instead, people made room in the pews, silent but not hostile. Hans sat near the back, Otto beside him, Wilhelm further away with his arms crossed tightly. The air inside was cool, filled with the faint aroma of wood polish and wax candles. When the first hymn began, the sound rose like a tide, voices strong, weaving together in harmony. Hans felt the notes strike something deep within. He had not heard communal singing since before the war, when Anna used to drag him to Christmas services. The memory washed over him with unexpected force. For a moment he forgot the fences, forgot the label of prisoner. He was simply a man among men sharing breath and sound. Otto leaned close, whispering, "It feels different here, doesn't it?" Hans nodded slowly. "Yes, free." The word tasted strange on his tongue, as if he had borrowed it from someone else. Yet it felt true. The simple act of sitting among strangers, listening to voices rise in unity, carried more liberation than the commander's declaration months ago. When the pastor spoke, Hans understood only fragments, but the tone was enough. It was not the sharp bark of orders, not the clipped cadence of propaganda. It was gentle, steady, filled with the weight of someone who believed in what he said. Hans watched the villagers bow their heads, watched their hands fold together not in discipline but in trust. Wilhelm muttered afterward, his tone sharp, "Don't let this fool you. Their prayers are not for us. They pray for their victory, for our defeat." Hans met his gaze, calm but firm. Maybe, but their voices did not sound like victory. They sounded like hope. Wilhelm sneered but offered no reply. As they left the church, Hans stepped outside into the golden light of afternoon. The air felt different, lighter, as if he had shed a weight he hadn't realized he carried. For the first time, the sky above the camp seemed less like a ceiling and more like a vast invitation. On the walk back, Michael caught up beside him. "What did you think?" he asked. Hans searched for the right words. "It was more freedom than I expected." Michael smiled faintly. "Sometimes freedom isn't bars breaking. Sometimes it's just being allowed to stand where you didn't think you could." Hans carried that thought with him all the way back to the fences. He knew the wires still stood, the guards still watched, the war still loomed behind him. But inside, something had shifted. He had tasted freedom, not as a declaration, not as escape, but as a song shared among strangers. And once a man has tasted freedom, no fence can erase it from his mouth. The church service lingered in Hans's thoughts long after the prisoners were marched back behind the fences. He carried the sound of voices rising together, the warmth of strangers who had made space for him, and the faint taste of freedom that had settled in his chest. But not everyone felt the same. In the barracks the mood grew tense, whispers sharp as knives. Wilhelm stood near the doorway, his back straight, his expression stern. He spoke with the authority of a man who believed silence was weakness. "Do you not see what they are doing? They lure you with songs and smiles, and already you begin to forget who you are. You sit among them like guests, but you are prisoners. Do not mistake this for kindness. It is conquest." The room hummed with unease. Ernst nodded in agreement, muttering, "We should not have gone. It makes us look weak." Hans felt his chest tighten. For weeks he had remained quiet, letting Wilhelm's words dominate the barracks, but now something inside him burned too hot to contain. He rose slowly from his bunk, his voice firm though his hands trembled. "You speak of strength, Wilhelm, but what has your strength brought us? Look at Germany. Ashes, hunger, ruins. My sister writes of children starving, of people lining up for crumbs. That is what your loyalty gave us. Tell me, what honor is there in that?" The barracks fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward Hans. Wilhelm's jaw clenched, his face hardening like stone. "You dare?" he hissed. "You dare speak against the men who gave their lives for our nation?" Hans's voice grew steadier, fueled by the weight of his sister's letter, by the kindness he had tasted outside the fence. "Yes, they gave their lives, and for what? For lies, for a future that turned to dust before it even arrived. I no longer care about flags or speeches. I care about the living, about my sister, about survival, about dignity that does not come from hate." Otto shifted on his bunk, his voice low but clear. "He's right." Wilhelm's eyes darted to him, sharp as a blade. "And you, Otto? Will you betray your homeland too?" Otto's shoulders stiffened, but he did not look away. "If loyalty means watching children starve, then yes. I would rather betray lies than betray them." The tension snapped like a rope pulled too tight. Some men muttered their agreement, others remained silent, caught between fear and the crack in Wilhelm's armor. For the first time, Hans saw doubt flicker in the eyes of those who usually nodded to Wilhelm's every word. Wilhelm stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Careful, Keller. Words are seeds. Once planted, they grow, and not all growth is welcome." Hans held his gaze. "Then let them grow, because silence is worse." The air in the barracks was thick with unspoken thoughts, the sound of breaths held too long. Wilhelm turned away sharply, retreating to his corner, his silence heavier than his words had been. Hans sank back onto his bunk, his pulse racing, his hands trembling as though he had just stepped off a battlefield. Otto leaned closer, whispering, "You broke the silence. That takes more strength than shouting orders." Hans managed a faint smile, though his chest still heaved. Maybe. Or maybe I've only started a fight I cannot win. Otto shook his head. No. You've started something we all needed. As night fell, Hans lay awake, listening to the steady hum of crickets outside. For the first time, Wilhelm's voice did not dominate the barracks. His words had cracked the silence, and within that crack lay the faintest glimmer of change. The summer heat bore down on the prisoners as they worked the farmland outside the camp. Rows of corn stretched toward the horizon, the stalks swaying under a faint breeze that did little to ease the sweat soaking their shirts. Hans wiped his brow, gripping the handle of the hoe with blistered hands. Each movement was mechanical, but the rhythm kept his mind from drifting too far into darker places. Michael strolled nearby with his rifle slung loosely across his shoulder, watching more like a supervisor than a guard. "Keep steady," he called, his voice carrying no threat, only encouragement. Hans glanced at him briefly and returned to his work. He had grown used to the American's presence, his casual tone, his habit of treating the men as workers rather than captives. Still, Hans felt the weight of Wilhelm's watchful eyes somewhere behind him, waiting for a misstep. The sound of a sudden crash broke the monotony. A wagon loaded with hay lurched as one of its wheels gave way, the heavy frame tipping violently. A child's scream pierced the air. A boy no older than 8 had been perched on the edge of the wagon, now tumbling dangerously close to the wooden axle and the splintering wheel. Without thinking, Hans dropped his hoe and sprinted forward. His boots tore through the dirt, his lungs burning. He reached the wagon just as the boy's legs slipped beneath the collapsing weight. Hans lunged, grabbing the child under his arms and pulling with all the strength his aching body could muster. The boy cried out, his small frame shaking in Hans's grip, but he was clear of the wheel when it slammed into the ground with a shattering thud. Dust rose around them. Hans fell to his knees, holding the child close for a moment before pushing him gently toward safety. The boy's wide eyes blinked up at him, filled with shock and relief. The farmer, an older man with weathered skin, rushed over. "My boy," he cried, scooping the child into his arms. He turned to Hans, his voice thick. "You saved him." Hans stood, breathing hard, his chest heaving. "It was nothing," he said in halting English, but his shaking hands betrayed the weight of the moment. Michael approached quickly, his expression unreadable at first, then softening into something more. He placed a hand on Hans's shoulder. "That was something," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The farmer's wife appeared, tears streaking her cheeks, pressing Hans's hands between hers. "Danke," she whispered, her German clumsy but heartfelt. Around them the other prisoners watched in silence. Some looked astonished, others uneasy, as if unsure how to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Otto gave Hans a faint nod of pride, while Ernst muttered under his breath, "One good deed doesn't change who we are." And Wilhelm, Hans caught his glare, sharp as steel, his lips pressed thin. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Wilhelm saw this not as heroism, but as betrayal. On the ride back to camp, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. The boy's laughter still echoed faintly in Hans's ears, a sound both fragile and eternal. For the first time, Hans felt a sense of pride not tied to uniform or command, but to something far simpler, saving a life because it was human. Otto leaned close in the truck bed, his voice low. "You didn't hesitate, that was different." Hans stared at the fading horizon, his muscles aching, his mind restless. "Maybe I didn't think. Maybe I just knew it was the only choice." The wheels rattled against the dirt road, carrying them back behind fences once more. Yet Hans felt changed, as if one act had shifted the balance inside him. The lines between prisoner and captor, enemy and ally, blurred in that dusty field. And once blurred, they were not so easily redrawn. The camp stirred with a new kind of tension, one that hummed beneath every whispered conversation. Rumors spread like wildfire, carried from bunk to bunk, passed in cautious tones around the evening meals. Men leaned in close, their voices lowered but eyes bright with anticipation. The whispers spoke of the war's end, of ships preparing to take them back across the ocean. Hans heard it first from Otto, who leaned against his bunk with an eager glint in his tired eyes. "They say it's only weeks now." "The war is finished, and soon they'll send us home." Hans's heart leapt, but almost immediately sank beneath the weight of the word home. What was home now? His mind returned to Anna's letter, to the ruins of Munich, to the children who cried themselves to sleep from hunger. Could that broken city still claim the word home? Ernst spoke up from across the room, his tone sharp. "Don't believe everything you hear. Release might come, yes, but not for all. Some of us will rot here while others walk free." Wilhelm seized on that doubt, his voice commanding. "Even if they send us back, remember this. We return as soldiers, not beggars. We must carry our discipline, our pride. America will not change us." Hans clenched his fists, torn between the flicker of hope and the heavy chains of uncertainty. That night, he dreamt of Anna again, her face pale, her eyes hollow with hunger. She stood amid the rubble of their childhood street, calling his name. But when he reached for her, she faded into smoke. He awoke with sweat dampening his shirt, the dream leaving behind an ache sharper than any wound. The following day, during work detail, Michael approached Hans as the men gathered tools. "You've heard, haven't you?" he asked in a low voice. Hans studied his face. "The rumors?" Michael nodded. "Not just rumors. Orders came down. The war's done. You'll be going back sooner than you think." Hans's breath caught. He searched Michael's expression for deceit but found only sincerity. "Back to Germany?" "Yes." Michael hesitated, his voice softening. "I don't know what you'll find there, Keller, but it won't be the same place you left." Hans swallowed hard. It hasn't been the same for years. Otto, overhearing, leaned closer. "It's real, then?" "We are leaving." Michael gave a short nod before moving away, leaving Otto nearly trembling with relief. "Hans, can you believe it? Soon we'll see our families again." But Hans could not summon the same joy. A weight pressed against him, the burden of choice. He longed to see Anna, to hold proof that she had survived. Yet part of him dreaded stepping back into the ruins, where every corner would remind him of loss. America, with its open skies and unexpected kindness, had unsettled him, shown him another way of living. Could he return to the ashes after breathing this air? That evening, as the barracks buzzed with speculation, Wilhelm's voice rose once more. "Remember who you are. Do not return broken. Do not return soft. When we step back onto German soil, we will rebuild not with weakness, but with steel." Hans listened, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He saw not steel but bread, not banners but faces. His sister's survival depended on something more than pride. And as he folded Anna's letter again before slipping it under his pillow, he whispered to himself words no one else could hear. "I must choose more than where I go. I must choose who I will be." The whispers of release did not bring only hope. They brought the heaviest questions Hans had ever faced. The announcement came quietly, almost casually, yet it thundered in Hans's chest. Within days, the prisoners would be transported back to Germany. The war was over, their confinement nearly finished. The camp buzzed with voices, some jubilant, some anxious, some too weary to feel either. For Hans, the news was a weight pressing hard against his ribs. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Hans found Michael leaning against the fence, his rifle slung as always, though his posture was more relaxed than usual. For a moment, Hans simply watched him, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his freckles caught the fading light. Then he approached slowly. "So it's true," Hans began. His English was careful, but his voice steady. "We are leaving," Michael nodded. "Orders came down this morning. Ships are waiting. In a week you'll be on your way back." Hans stared past the wire at the endless Texas sky. "Back," he repeated, though the word felt heavy, uncertain. "Germany is not what it was. I'm not sure I know what home means anymore." Michael studied him quietly, then spoke with a gentleness Hans had not expected. "Home isn't always where you come from. Sometimes it's where you find peace." Hans let the words linger. He thought of Anna, of Munich's ruins, of the letter that still slept beneath his pillow. He thought too of this land, the vast skies, the kindness of strangers, the moments of dignity he had never imagined possible in captivity. "You've changed," Michael said suddenly, breaking Hans's silence. "When you first came, your eyes were hard, distant. Now they carry something else, maybe hope. Maybe something heavier, but it's different." Hans almost smiled. "And you treated me not as an enemy, but as a man that I will not forget." Michael shifted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "War makes enemies of men who might have been friends. I've always believed that. You and I, we're proof of it." Hans's throat tightened. "I don't know what waits for me there, but I know what I found here." Michael met his eyes then, firm and steady. "Listen, Keller. Peace isn't handed down by commanders. It's not written in treaties. Peace is a battle too, the hardest one. You fight it every day in how you choose to live, how you treat others, how you remember. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words sank deep, heavier than any order Hans had ever obeyed. He nodded slowly. "I will remember." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full. The crickets had begun their nightly chorus, and the camp settled into its familiar rhythms. Yet Hans felt the moment carve itself into him like a scar he would carry forever. Finally, Michael extended his hand. "Farewell, Hans." Hans looked at it, then grasped it firmly. Their hands met across the line that had once marked them as enemies. "Farewell, Michael." Neither said more. Words would have been too small for what the silence already held. That night Hans lay on his bunk, unable to sleep. He traced every detail of their farewell in his mind, hearing Michael's words over and over. Peace is a battle too. He thought of Wilhelm's speeches, of the whispers of loyalty and steel, and realized they had lost their hold on him. The real strength, he now knew, was not in clinging to ruins, but in choosing to fight for a peace fragile and uncertain. As the barracks drifted into slumber, Hans closed his eyes, carrying Michael's words like a compass for the road ahead. The farewell was not an ending. It was a beginning he had not yet defined. The ship that carried Hans back across the Atlantic smelled of salt, rust, and fatigue. Unlike the journey out, the men no longer sat in stunned silence. Now their voices rose in fragments, songs, arguments, memories of home retold as if words could rebuild what bombs had taken. Hans listened quietly, staring at the endless grey sea, his thoughts torn between what awaited him in Germany and what he had left behind in America. When the ship finally docked, the sight that met them was not triumph, not even relief. It was devastation. The port itself bore scars of bombardment, warehouses gutted, cranes twisted like broken bones. As the men disembarked, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and damp ash. The streets beyond were lined with buildings reduced to hollow shells, their windows shattered, their walls pocked with holes. Hans walked through Munich with Otto by his side, both men silent at first, overwhelmed by the ruin. Rubble choked the alleys they had once known, piles of stone where homes and shops had stood. Children with gaunt faces scavenged through debris, their small hands blackened with soot. Women queued for bread, their eyes empty of expectation, their patience born of necessity rather than hope. Hans's chest ached as he searched for one face among the ruins. When he finally found her, his knees nearly buckled. Anna stood near a water pump, her frame thinner than he remembered, her hair streaked with grey, though she was only a year older than he. Yet when her eyes met his, they lit with a mixture of disbelief and joy. "Hans," she whispered, her voice trembling. He rushed to her, gathering her into his arms, holding her tightly as though afraid she might vanish like in his dreams. "Anna," he choked out. "I'm here. I'm alive." Tears streaked her face as she clung to him. "I prayed. Every day I prayed you would come back." They walked together through the ruined streets, Anna describing the long months of survival, nights in basements as bombs fell, days spent bartering scraps for food, weeks where she wondered if she would ever see her brother again. Hans listened, each word striking deeper than any wound. When they reached what remained of their family home, Hans stood in silence. The roof was gone, the windows shattered, the walls cracked and leaning. Inside, only fragments of their childhood remained, broken furniture, a photograph half burned, the smell of mold and decay. "This is what is left," Anna said quietly, her hand resting on his arm. Hans closed his eyes, Michael's words echoing in his mind. Peace is a battle, too. Here, amid the ruins, that truth became painfully real. This was not victory. This was survival stripped bare, demanding courage of a different kind. That night, Hans sat with Anna by the faint glow of a lantern. She asked about his time in America, her curiosity sharp despite her exhaustion. He hesitated, then told her of the skies, the kindness of strangers, the bread offered freely, the music that had felt like freedom. Anna listened intently. "It sounds like another world." Hans nodded slowly. "It was. And yet, it taught me something we must carry here. That dignity does not come from power or fear. It comes from how we live, even in ruin." She looked at him, her tired eyes glimmering with fragile hope. "Then we will live, Hans. Somehow we will live." Hans knew the road ahead would not be easy. Hunger, rubble, and grief lay in every corner. But as he held his sister's hand, he understood that America had given him more than memories. It had given him a vision of what life could be, a vision he was determined to plant in this broken soil. The days in Munich unfolded slowly, each one filled with the weight of rebuilding. Hans rose early with Anna, carrying buckets of water, scavenging through rubble for anything useful, standing in endless lines for food that never seemed to stretch far enough. Yet beneath the exhaustion, he felt a strange strength guiding him, a strength that had not been born in the ruins of Germany, but across the ocean, in the fields and skies of America. Neighbors gathered in the evenings, sharing what little they had, their voices heavy with grief but also stubborn resilience. Hans listened, then spoke when silence grew too thick. "We cannot live by anger alone," he told them one night. "Anger will not feed us nor rebuild our homes. What I saw in America was not weakness. It was the strength to begin again, even when nothing is certain." An older man scoffed. "Easy to speak of America. You were a prisoner there. What do they know of our suffering?" Hans met his gaze calmly. "They know suffering in their own way. But what they taught me is this. Peace is not given by commanders or speeches. Peace is something we must fight for every day, with dignity, with kindness, even when the world tempts us toward bitterness." Anna squeezed his hand beneath the table, her silent agreement strengthening his resolve. Over time, Hans noticed small changes. A neighbor shared half a loaf with another family. A boy hummed a tune while carrying bricks, the sound fragile but full of defiance. These were not grand victories, but they were seeds Hans recognized from the fields where he had once labored under guard, seeds he now sought to plant here among the ruins. One evening, as he sat with Anna near the broken frame of their childhood home, she asked softly, "Do you ever wish you had stayed in America?" Hans considered the question, his eyes tracing the horizon where the sun dipped low. "America gave me a glimpse of what peace could be," he admitted. "But if I stayed, I would only carry it for myself. Here with you, I can try to make it grow. Even if it is only a little." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then we will make it grow together." Hans closed his eyes, hearing again Michael's voice. "Peace is a battle too." Those words had carried him across the sea, through the ruins, into this fragile present. Now they shaped his every step. The war had ended with commanders declaring freedom, but Hans understood that freedom was not in the announcement. It was in the choices made afterward. Freedom was in breaking silence against Wilhelm's tyranny, in accepting bread from a stranger, in saving a child without hesitation, in holding on to hope even when rubble surrounded him. He rose the next morning with renewed determination. As he worked beside Anna, clearing stone and patching walls, he felt the lessons of America alive in every gesture. Dignity in labor, strength in kindness, peace as something built, not given. And though he knew scars of war would never fully fade, he also knew they did not have to define what came after. Peace was fragile, yes, but fragility did not mean weakness. It meant care, responsibility, and the courage to defend it daily. Hans Keller was no longer a soldier, no longer just a prisoner returned from captivity. He was a man who had learned that borders could not contain humanity, that even across oceans the possibility of peace could reach and take root. The war was over, but his battle had only begun, the battle to nurture peace in a land that needed it most. And so his story reminds us, true peace is not declared. It is chosen, lived and carried forward by those willing to fight for it in ordinary ways. If you followed Hans's journey until now, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that keep history alive. And before you leave, click on the suggested video now on your screen, because one story always leads to another, and the lessons of the past are never truly finished.